Before we dive into this story, which is a bit of a roller coaster, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment with your city and country, and let's see how far this story travels. Alright, let's get started. Funny how sometimes the things you never see coming end up right on your doorstep, uninvited and unwelcome. I always believed Emily and I had a pretty strong relationship, or at the very least, something we could work on if it started to crack. Sure, like any couple, we had our ups and downs, but recently it felt like there was this tiny fracture running through us, one of those things you don't notice until it's already a problem. A few years back, Emily and I packed up and moved to Seattle, Washington, aiming for a fresh start in a city buzzing with life. We both fell in love with the energy of the place, the cozy coffee shops, the vibrant waterfront, the lively weekend markets. Now, thinking back, I realize how much I brushed off, chalking things up to mood swings or work stress. Turns out, it was way more than just that. At the time, Emily was 46 and had always been warm and easygoing. I worked in software development, which often meant long hours staring at a screen, making it easy to lose touch with everything else. She always seemed to get it, until, all of a sudden, something changed. It started out subtly, or maybe it didn't, and I was just too wrapped up to see it. One night, Emily came home unusually late, and when she walked in, she barely glanced my way, not even bothering with our usual small talk. I asked her how her evening was, and her reply was so brief, it felt like she had someplace else she'd rather be. We were in the same room, but it felt like she was somewhere far away. She'd be glued to her phone, her focus entirely on whatever was on that screen. Whenever I tried to connect, it felt like pulling teeth to get a word out of her. This was new. We used to talk about everything, plans for the weekend, our dreams, and all that. Now, it was like all of that was just gone. The first moment I really felt something was off was one morning over breakfast. We were both having coffee in the kitchen, the early sunlight spilling through the windows. Emily was staring at her phone, her face lighting up now and then with a smile. I'd never seen her look so distant, and yet so entertained all at once. Then, out of the blue, she let out this small laugh. Half joking, I asked, "Who's got you smiling like that?" For just a split second, she froze, then quickly shrugged it off, saying, "Oh, it's just something from work," and changed the subject so fast it made my head spin. Something about her reaction didn't sit right with me. I told myself it was just work stuff, or maybe I was just overthinking things. But that nagging feeling didn't go away. From that point, things just got weirder. Emily started dressing differently, buying clothes that seemed way pricier than what she'd normally go for. When I casually asked about it, she said she wanted to look more professional for her team. This was the same Emily who used to laugh at designer labels. Now she was practically living in them. Then there were the work gatherings. Usually, I'd have to talk her into going to social events, but all of a sudden, she was the one going out more, attending these work meetups at places like Pure Point Bar and Grill, a fancy spot downtown. She said they were strictly professional and insisted that it'd be awkward if I tagged along. One evening, curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to swing by, thinking it would be a fun surprise. I figured she'd be happy to see me. But when I walked in, there she was, sitting close to her boss, Mike. She'd mentioned Mike before, but seeing them together, laughing and leaning in, felt like a punch to the gut. She looked at him with a warmth I hadn't seen in a long time. And when she noticed me, her face went pale. She scrambled to explain they were just discussing work stuff. After that night, things only seemed to unravel faster. Emily became more distant, and the changes kept coming. She picked up new hobbies, like joining a downtown yoga studio she'd never shown interest in before, and spent weekends at business retreats or networking events. When I asked if I could tag along, she brushed it off, saying it was industry-specific, and I wouldn't enjoy it. That was odd. Emily always loved doing things together. The more I observed, the more details started piling up. She started splurging on high-end makeup, perfumes, accessories, things she'd never cared about before. It felt like I was watching her slowly become someone else. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her, bit by bit. Then came a morning that's still clear in my memory. I woke up to find her already dressed, putting on a beautiful new bracelet I hadn't seen before. I couldn't help but ask, "That's a nice bracelet. Did you buy it recently?" Her answer was almost too quick. "Oh, it was a gift from a coworker. They all pitched in for my birthday," she said, her smile barely reaching her eyes, and something in her voice felt off. My gut twisted with unease. Emily's birthday had been months ago, and there had been no mention of gifts from any coworkers back then. By this time, I'd already started confiding in my old college buddy, Brian. He'd known Emily and me since the beginning of our relationship. I laid it all out for him: the coldness, the strange events, the gift bracelet from coworkers. Brian listened without a word of dismissal or telling me I was overreacting. Instead, he suggested, "Maybe you should talk to her directly. Or maybe think about counseling. If you want to save this, you'll need to face it head on." Taking his advice, I brought up the idea of counseling to Emily one evening. Her reaction floored me. She practically scoffed, waving the suggestion away with, "Counseling? For what? You're making a big deal out of nothing." Her eyes flashed with irritation, her expression colder than ever. It stung deeply. That's when I realized this wasn't just a rough patch, something had truly changed. In the weeks that followed, I became hyper-aware of everything she did. She started coming home late more often, claiming to be at dinner meetings or out with colleagues. But some nights, she wouldn't come home at all, saying she was out of town for a conference. She ignored my calls, barely replied to my texts, and any trace of affection between us had vanished. I'd get the usual, "I'm tired," or "maybe tomorrow," until I eventually stopped asking altogether. I couldn't keep sitting around while these suspicions gnawed at me. I needed answers. So, I did something I never imagined I would. I started checking her social media and her recent activity, even glancing at her credit card statements. At first, there were only a few odd charges here and there, dinners at places she never mentioned. But then I found receipts, hotel stays, restaurant bills in nearby towns, purchases that made no sense at all. The worst part was, even as these small discoveries piled up, I still couldn't bring myself to confront her. A part of me clung to the hope of an innocent explanation, though deep down, I knew we were past the point of no return. One evening, while she was supposedly out at another urgent work meeting, she left her laptop on the kitchen counter. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, debating with myself. I knew that opening it would cross a line, but then again, hadn't she already crossed one herself? My hands shook as I lifted the lid, my heart pounding. She hadn't even logged out. Her email inbox was right there, almost as if it was waiting for me. I told myself that if I found nothing, I'd close it and never mention it. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew what I'd see. There it was, plain as day, emails from Mike, her boss. Just seeing his name made my stomach turn. I opened one message, and it confirmed every fear I'd been trying to ignore. The exchanges were filled with flirtations and compliments, phrases like, "Can't wait to see you again," and "Last night was incredible." Every line felt like a knife to my heart. As if that wasn't enough, I found messages where she talked about me, describing me as predictable and uninspired, as if I were some burden holding her back. The pain of reading those words was almost unbearable. I had supported her through every career choice, every whim, and now I was nothing but an inconvenience. I read each email, feeling more betrayed with every line. She hadn't even tried to hide it. I'd been so naive, so blind, thinking her late nights were all about dedication to her job. It turned out her dedication was for this hidden life with Mike. In a haze of shock, I closed the laptop and immediately called Brian, the one person who had truly understood my suspicions. I told him everything, every painful detail. He was silent for a long moment, then finally said, "Look, you need to think carefully about what you do next. Confronting her might not be enough." He suggested I reach out to Mike's wife, Sarah, to see if she had any idea of what was going on in her own marriage. The thought hadn't crossed my mind, but the more Brian talked, the more sense it made. I wasn't the only one suffering here. Maybe Sarah was living the same nightmare. That night, I found her on social media and sent a careful message explaining my suspicions and what I'd discovered. I expected her to deny it or even get defensive, but the next morning she replied confirming that she'd had her own doubts. She suggested we meet to discuss everything, so we decided on the Timberline Cafe, a small, out-of-the-way place on the edge of town. When I arrived, I recognized her right away. She looked as exhausted as I felt. Her eyes met mine, and in that instant, there was an unspoken understanding between us, a shared sadness, a bond born from betrayal. I laid it all out for Laura, the emails, the late nights, the unexplained changes in Emily's behavior. She listened quietly, her face growing paler with each detail. Then, she opened up about her own suspicions, recounting how Mike had been coming home late, taking mysterious weekend business trips, and acting colder than ever. As we talked, an idea began to form. This wasn't just about confronting them. It was about making them face the consequences of their actions. Over the next few hours, Laura and I pieced together everything we knew about Emily and Mike. She revealed that Mike had a history of crossing boundaries with female employees, but she never imagined he'd go this far, especially with someone like Emily. As we continued sharing, I could see a newfound resolve in Laura's eyes. This wasn't only about betrayal, it was about reclaiming control over our lives. Laura mentioned she had connections within the company, people who could start subtle rumors about Mike's mentorship with Emily. But we both knew rumors alone wouldn't be enough. We needed something concrete, something that would shake them both. Then Laura dropped a bombshell. She told me Mike was on shaky financial ground and had been using company funds to cover personal expenses, disguising them as business dinners and meetings. She suggested that if we could expose his shady practices, we might not only ruin his career but also bring Emily down with him. The opportunity was staggering, and I couldn't believe the leverage we suddenly had. To keep things discreet, I reached out to another friend, Chris, who had connections in the corporate world. He could discreetly ask around, making sure whispers about Emily and Mike's relationship would circulate through the right channels. If enough people heard, it would inevitably reach the higher-ups. Meanwhile, Laura and I continued meeting regularly at Timberline Cafe, refining our plan and sharing any new information we uncovered. She'd even been able to gather receipts and documents that hinted at Mike's misuse of company funds, each piece bringing us one step closer to justice. One evening, Laura invited me over to her house to go over everything we'd gathered. It felt surreal sitting in the very place where Mike had betrayed her, yet here we were, planning his downfall. As we worked, I noticed her resolve. Despite everything, she remained focused and determined. It was clear she, too, had been waiting for this chance to restore her dignity. We decided to send an anonymous complaint to the company, detailing Mike's financial misconduct and attaching copies of receipts and expense records Laura had found. We structured it carefully, making it look legitimate and leaving no way for it to trace back to us. The goal was to spark an internal investigation that would leave Mike scrambling to explain himself. As the weeks passed, our plan began to take hold. Rumors about Mike and Emily started circulating, murmurs of favoritism and unprofessional conduct. At the same time, the company's finance team noticed discrepancies in Mike's expenses, and the investigation began to pick up steam. Before long, Mike's once perfect reputation started to unravel. Meanwhile, Emily remained oblivious to the storm brewing around her. She kept coming home late, attending business meetings, and acting as though everything was perfectly normal, unaware that her carefully crafted world was on the brink of collapse. The final blow came during a high-profile corporate event at the Settestone Hotel, one of the city's most prestigious venues. This was the kind of gathering where reputations could be made or destroyed, and as a senior leader, Mike was expected to make a strong showing. Emily had already mentioned she'd be there, so I decided I'd attend, too. This time, I was done playing the clueless, supportive husband. I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices. As I arrived, I could sense the tension in the room. Mike and Emily were mingling with their colleagues, but there were subtle glances and whispered conversations happening all around them. I made my way through the crowd, and as I approached, Emily spotted me. The shock on her face was priceless. She hadn't expected me to show up, and she definitely hadn't anticipated the confidence with which I walked over to her group. "Hey, Em," I said loud enough for her colleagues to hear. "How's everything going with Mike these days?" My tone was casual, but I could see the color drain from her face. She stammered, trying to brush it off as work-related, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook so easily. "Oh, just curious," I said, feigning casual interest. "You seem to be spending a lot of time with him, especially on those late nights." I saw her colleagues exchange uncertain glances, and the suspicion in their eyes was unmistakable. Samantha tried to laugh it off, but the unease in her expression was clear. She could feel the doubt beginning to grow among those around her. After that night, things began to spiral quickly for both of them. The investigation into Tom's financial misconduct gained momentum. Laura strategically leaked more of the evidence we'd collected, and soon the company's leadership could no longer brush it aside. Every new piece of evidence painted Tom as a liability, someone abusing his position for personal gain. The board, once loyal to him, began losing faith, and Tom could sense the walls closing in. For Samantha, the whispers about her special relationship with Tom had spread to her family, friends, and colleagues. She tried reaching out to her parents for support, but they were as disillusioned as I was. For the first time, Samantha was without the safety net she'd always depended on. Her reputation was cracking, and I could see the strain was taking its toll. Meanwhile, Laura and I kept our sights on bringing down Tom's career, and by association, Samantha's. With every new document and every strategic leak, the internal investigation grew more severe. The final blow came when Laura, with some help from Eric, anonymously provided key financial records to an external auditor. That was enough to trigger a full-blown forensic audit into Tom's finances, a situation he couldn't wriggle his way out of. As everything started to unravel, I felt a sense of relief. The anger and betrayal that had haunted me were slowly replaced by a quiet satisfaction. Samantha's choices had finally caught up with her, and the life she'd built on deception was crumbling. As the audit advanced, Tom's world fell apart at an astonishing rate. Auditors uncovered years of suspect expenses disguised as client dinners and business trips, but they were, in fact, lavish indulgences for himself. His colleagues, who once admired him, now saw him as a man who had used his influence recklessly. The board, outraged, gave him an ultimatum: resign quietly or face formal charges. The fallout hit Samantha, too. With Tom's reputation in ruins, people began to question her role in his rise. Coworkers who had once respected her now saw her as a mere pawn in Tom's schemes. Office gossip hinted that she'd climbed the ranks through her relationship with him rather than her work ethic. Her pride, once a shield, was now in tatters. Amid all this, I made a decision to finalize my own chapter. I filed for divorce and handed Samantha the papers when she least expected it. Her face showed pure shock. She never thought it would come to this. She tried to explain, saying it wasn't what it seemed, but her excuses felt empty. I'd seen the truth, and there was no going back. The divorce moved swiftly. With her reputation in tatters, Samantha couldn't leverage her position like before. Our mutual friends had heard about her actions, and even her family, once fiercely supportive, found it hard to defend her. She was left to piece together a life she had unraveled with her own choices. Meanwhile, Laura and I pressed on with our efforts to expose Tom. As the forensic audit brought his misconduct to light, word spread quickly in business circles. Tom went from a respected leader to a cautionary tale, and as the press caught wind of the scandal, his name became synonymous with corporate deceit. As Samantha dealt with the wreckage, I found solace in my friends and in a new venture I'd been planning for a while. With encouragement from Daniel and Joy, a friend who'd been by my side through everything, I began building a small consulting business. Joy had a keen eye for opportunity, and a genuine passion for helping others succeed. Together, we put in long hours, and soon the business began to thrive. Over time, Joy became more than just a friend and business partner. She was a reminder that loyalty and integrity still existed, a stark contrast to the betrayal I had endured. She valued me for who I was, not for what I could offer or what my status might bring. Working alongside her felt like a breath of fresh air after a long, stifling storm. As months passed, I found a genuine sense of closure. Samantha had lost everything she had taken for granted: her reputation, her relationship with her family, and the life she'd wrapped around Tom. And for the first time in a long while, I felt free to move forward with my own life. In the end, Samantha was left to face the consequences of her actions on her own. But for me, life was finally moving in a better direction. I was building something genuine with joy, and the bitterness that once consumed me had faded away. I'd found a new path forward, one grounded in honesty and trust, rather than deceit and betrayal. Samantha and Tom's little empire, built on lies and manipulation, had collapsed. While they were left to reckon with the fallout, I had finally found peace. For the first time in years, I felt ready to embrace the future, taking one honest step at a time. As their scandal hit the media, the story of Tom's misconduct mixed with rumors of his affair with Samantha painted a harsh picture in the corporate world and in public. The board moved quickly, forcing him out, and the company released a statement condemning his behavior. His professional network abandoned him, and he soon realized he'd lost all the influence he once held. Samantha, meanwhile, faced her own exile. Her reputation, now tied to Tom's disgrace, closed doors that once opened easily. The corporate world grew cold, and even her friends kept their distance, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. For the first time, she felt the isolation and humiliation her own choices had brought. But as their lives unraveled, I felt something surprising: peace. I had reclaimed control over my life and found a purpose that went beyond what I'd lost. The consulting business Joy and I started was thriving, and together, we were helping other businesses succeed with integrity and a genuine commitment to value. As time passed, Joy and I grew closer. She understood me in ways I hadn't experienced before, and her calm, steady presence brought a quiet happiness I hadn't realized I needed. What began as a partnership turned into a relationship, natural and true, built on mutual respect and trust. She wasn't just my business partner, she was my partner in life, a reminder that real love and loyalty could exist. Months turned into a year, and life settled into a hopeful new rhythm. The bitterness that once weighed me down had been replaced with a sense of fulfillment. My past with Samantha had taught me valuable lessons that I could carry forward without regret. As for Samantha and Tom, they were left to pick up the scattered pieces of their lives, burdened by the consequences of their own choices. They'd gambled everything on a fleeting affair, and in the end, they were left with nothing but the ashes of what they had destroyed. I had finally found freedom, not just from the betrayal, but from the anger and resentment that had once held me back. With Joy beside me, I was ready to embrace a future built on trust, moving forward one honest day at a time.